This report does not seek to fascinate, it seeks to understand. Understanding is not excusing, it is refusing to let it happen again in the shadows.
The vibrant marketplace hums with the energy of daily life as vendors offer fresh fruit and handmade goods. Children laugh freely, darting between the narrow, crowded stalls. A polite, unassuming merchant extends a small coin to a passing child, offering a seemingly warm and gentle smile. Then the innocent child simply vanished forever. What does it take for an ordinary person to become a predator, and how does society fail to see it? Throughout this analysis, we will refer to our subject as the Highland Wraith. Between the late 60s and early 80s, hundreds of young victims disappeared without a trace across the remote, high-altitude regions. Operating as a transient drifter, he exploited the vast, unmonitored borders of Peru, Colombia, and Ecuador. His unprecedented mobility allowed him to strike and vanish unnoticed. The scale of this crime spree remains one of the most staggering in modern investigative history, leaving a chilling legacy that authorities are still struggling to fully comprehend. By targeting the most vulnerable and overlooked populations, the profile evaded law enforcement for over a decade. He slipped seamlessly through the cracks of a fragile system. The subject utilized the bustling crowds and transient nature of his environment to conceal his dark intentions. He thrived wherever poverty and neglect provided a perfect cover. The extensive investigation forced authorities to confront an uncomfortable truth about systemic failures. The profile manipulated these very blind spots with absolute, chilling precision and calculated intent. Entire communities were left searching for answers in the haunting silence of the mountains, forever scarred by the devastating shadow of an invisible, highly mobile phantom. To the untrained observer, he appeared entirely unremarkable. A polite, transient wanderer navigating bustling regional marketplaces. The subject seamlessly blended into the dense background of everyday survival and poverty. He deliberately adopted the non-threatening persona of a humble street merchant. This carefully constructed social facade disarmed wary adults and instantly gained the unreserved trust of isolated, overlooked populations. The profile utilized small tokens, a simple coin or a piece of food, to project warmth. These calculated gestures were highly practiced instruments of pure psychological manipulation and control. A soft, disarming smile was his most effective weapon. It projected absolute innocence and need, perfectly masking the profound lack of empathy that defined his severely fractured psychological state. By frequently asking for directions or a local guide, he inverted the traditional power dynamic. He manufactured a false vulnerability, making his targeted prey feel empowered, safe, and helpful. Society completely failed to see through this deception because he mirrored their own daily struggles. He hid his predatory nature behind the profound, blinding veil of systemic societal neglect. Beneath this cooperative, polite exterior lay an absolute emotional void. The subject experienced zero remorse, utilizing basic human connection merely as a strategic mechanism to isolate his chosen targets. He had perfected the ultimate camouflage, living as an invisible phantom in plain sight. But what happened when this meticulously crafted mask finally slipped, and the predator actually struck? The profile emerged from a highly volatile environment. Raised in absolute poverty by an abusive caregiver, the subject learned early that home offered no safety or sanctuary. Cast out into unforgiving urban streets at just 8 years old, he became a nameless wanderer. The harsh reality of survival completely fractured his fragile psychological foundation. Seeking refuge, the subject encountered only severe exploitation. Supposed sanctuaries and authority figures subjected him to profound, repeated abuse, utterly destroying his ability to trust human connection. These traumatic formative experiences embedded a deep, festering resentment. Society continually failed to protect him, reinforcing a twisted worldview where vulnerability guaranteed endless suffering and absolute victimization. The definitive fracture occurred during his first incarceration. Subjected to yet another brutal assault behind bars, his internal mechanics irrevocably shifted from passive victim to active aggressor. He retaliated with lethal precision against his tormentors. This specific trigger inverted his psychological dynamic, convincing the profile that absolute control required extreme, calculated, and uncompromising dominance. He resolved never to be prey again. The subject systematically forged a new, predatory identity, preparing to unleash his internalized rage upon the most defenseless populations available. The profile successfully exploited every vulnerability in the social and legal fabric. His case remains a dark milestone in the psychological study of extreme predatory behavior. We have examined his fractured origins, his calculated methods, and the systemic collapse that allowed his escape. Now, we possess all the elements to definitively classify this archetype. A perfectly constructed monster was now fully unleashed upon a blind society. But what happened when this deeply fractured individual finally crossed the ultimate line into serial predation? To fully understand the profile, investigators must rigidly separate his modus operandi from his psychological signature. His operational methods were entirely practical, designed for evasion and brutal efficiency. The subject consistently targeted crowded, impoverished marketplaces. He isolated vulnerable individuals by offering simple, calculated incentives. A small token or a promise of work effectively initiated the extraction. This was his strict operational method. He deliberately utilized chaotic, unmonitored daytime environments, leading his carefully chosen targets into desolate, forgotten areas without raising any immediate public alarm. However, his signature reveals the true underlying psychological compulsion. While his methods successfully facilitated the crime, his signature fulfilled a deep, fractured emotional need completely devoid of utility. The profile required absolute, uninterrupted control during the final moments of the attack. He needed to maintain direct, unbroken visual contact, demanding the victim's total and complete focus. This prolonged visual engagement was profoundly pathological. It allowed the subject to absorb their absolute terror, temporarily silencing the overwhelming inadequacy and powerlessness forged during his traumatic childhood. His methodology ensured survival, but this chilling visual signature ensured psychological gratification. He was not merely eliminating a witness. He was actively consuming their ultimate moment of vulnerability. Following the event, the subject exhibited severe, lingering possessive behaviors. He frequently returned to the isolated locations, treating the concealed areas as private domains of absolute, undisturbed ownership. He psychologically redefined these desolate spaces as hidden monuments to his absolute dominance. This post-incident ritual confirmed his compulsion was driven by an insatiable, overwhelming need for control. The profile was operating at the absolute peak of his predatory evolution, secure in the shadows. But eventually, every perfect system inevitably fractures, and the invisible becomes visible. Nature itself initiated the final, devastating collapse. A sudden, massive flash flood ravaged the regional landscape, unexpectedly unearthing the dark, hidden evidence he had meticulously buried for years. The shocking discovery of these concealed remains forced local authorities to immediately reopen numerous unresolved files. An invisible, systematic net slowly began to tighten around the transient predator. Decades of absolute impunity had fostered a dangerous, blinding arrogance. Despite the escalating police presence, the subject returned to his preferred, bustling hunting grounds without any hesitation. He utilized the exact same calculated methods of polite deception, offering a small coin to a potential target. However, this time, his predatory rhythm encountered an unexpected disruption. A highly observant guardian recognized his deceptive approach from a previous, failed encounter. She bravely intercepted his calculated advance, completely shattering his carefully constructed illusion of harmless vulnerability. She loudly alerted the surrounding, tightly knit community to the immediate threat. The previously passive, background crowd instantly transformed into a unified, defensive force against the exposed phantom. Enraged local merchants rapidly surrounded and subdued the profile. They firmly held the struggling predator captive, ensuring he could not vanish into the shadows before law enforcement arrived. Once confined within the sterile, oppressive walls of police custody, the subject deployed his ultimate defense mechanism. He maintained an absolute, chilling silence, completely refusing to cooperate. He understood that the physical evidence directly linking him to the vast scale of his crimes remained hidden. Without his own words, the institutional investigation was completely paralyzed. To break this impenetrable psychological fortress, an experienced investigator strategically went undercover. Disguised as a fellow prisoner, the detective was placed directly inside the subject's dark holding cell. For weeks, the undercover officer slowly manipulated the subject's overwhelming, narcissistic need for grand recognition. The detective offered a captive audience to a man desperate to feel powerful. Driven by pure ego, the carefully constructed mask finally shattered from within. Eager to boast about his immense control, the profile enthusiastically detailed his horrific, widespread actions. He inadvertently handed authorities the precise, chilling map to his own destruction, describing his methods and geographic reach with absolute, calculated precision and zero emotional remorse. The subsequent formal confession exposed a staggering, unprecedented scale of violence that left seasoned investigators completely paralyzed. The invisible phantom was finally trapped behind cold iron bars. Institutional pressure mounted as the true extent of the systemic failure became undeniable. The sheer volume of neglected cases demanded a massive, coordinated response from a fractured system. The immediate threat was neutralized, but investigators soon realized a terrifying truth. Capturing the predator was only the beginning of a much darker, systemic, and deeply disturbing nightmare. The subsequent legal proceedings exposed a staggering inadequacy within the justice system. Facing the court, the subject displayed absolutely no remorse for his extensive, calculated crimes. Instead of showing guilt, he exhibited profound grandiosity and narcissism. He proudly detailed his methods, viewing his horrific actions as a twisted, revolutionary mission. Psychiatrists diagnosed the profile with severe sociopathy and megalomania. He completely lacked empathy, thriving on the intense media attention and the sheer shock of the investigators. Despite the unprecedented scale of his offenses, the regional laws severely limited the prosecution. The maximum penalty allowed by the penal code was shockingly minimal. He received a sentence of merely 16 years. This lenient outcome sparked massive public outrage, devastating the countless families desperately seeking justice for their massive losses. Even more disturbing, the subject was released early for supposed good behavior. After 14 years, the most prolific predator in modern history walked freely out of prison. He was deported back to his country of origin. where authorities temporarily confined him to a psychiatric institution. However, bureaucratic failures continued to plague the case. Declared legally sane a few years later, he was released on a nominal bail. He promptly vanished into the shadows, leaving an agonizing, unresolved void behind. The lasting impact on society was profound and deeply traumatic. Entire communities remained paralyzed by fear, knowing the invisible phantom had completely evaded true, proportional justice. Vigilante groups and grieving relatives placed bounties on his head, hopelessly searching for closure. The devastating legacy of his impunity scarred the collective memory of the region. However, this catastrophic failure forced an immediate evolution in criminology and law enforcement. Authorities finally recognized the severe danger of transient predators crossing unmonitored international borders. The investigation highlighted critical, systemic blind spots regarding marginalized populations. Law enforcement developed new protocols to track highly mobile offenders who target impoverished, overlooked communities. Regional governments were compelled to restructure their penal codes, significantly increasing maximum sentences to prevent such a catastrophic legal failure from ever happening again.
The mystery is over. The trump card is on the table. So, did you recognize him?
The invisible phantom we have analyzed is finally unmasked as Pedro Lopez, historically documented as the monster of the Andes. Within our profile classification, he is designated as the Highland Wraith. This alias was chosen to reflect his spectral nature. A highly mobile predator who haunted the elevated borders of South America, striking silently before dissolving back into the fog of societal neglect. To fully deconstruct the psychological mechanics of this phantom, we must process his profile through the Pentagon of evil framework. The scale of his predation is staggering, with a confirmed victim count of 110 and estimates exceeding 300 individuals. Operating extensively between 1969 and 1980, the subject functioned as a transient drifter who systematically targeted vulnerable young girls across the unmonitored zones of Peru, Colombia, and Ecuador. Premeditation, 6 out of 10. Pedro Lopez did not construct elaborate, highly sophisticated traps. Rather, his premeditation was opportunistic yet deeply calculated. He haunted bustling marketplaces, relying on a practiced, disarming facade to single out the most vulnerable targets. By utilizing simple lures, such as a small coin or the promise of work, he isolated victims with chilling efficiency. His planning was primarily logistical, selecting chaotic environments and remote dumping grounds, rather than complexly engineered, earning him a moderate score in this criterion. Signature, 4 out of 10. His crimes were driven by a profound psychological compulsion, yet his signature lacked elaborate staging or highly stylized displays at the crime scene. The core of his signature was an intimate, pathological need for absolute dominance, manifested through demanding unbroken visual contact during the final moments of the attack. While he occasionally returned to the isolated locations to assert psychological ownership over the space, the absence of complex crime scene manipulation keeps the score relatively low. Mobility, 10 out of 10. This is the defining characteristic of his operational success. As a transient drifter, Lopez exploited the porous, unmonitored borders of Peru, Colombia, and Ecuador. He functioned entirely off the grid, continuously moving from one impoverished region to another before law enforcement could establish a discernible pattern. This unprecedented freedom of movement allowed him to amass a staggering victim count over a decade, making him practically invisible to regional authorities and securing a flawless score in mobility. Resistance, 8 out of 10. Lopez demonstrated a terrifying ability to evade permanent justice. Despite his eventual capture by vigilant citizens in Ecuador, he manipulated the psychiatric and legal systems to his ultimate advantage. After serving a remarkably short sentence for his confessed crimes, he was deported, transferred to a psychiatric institution, and ultimately released on nominal bail. By successfully vanishing back into the shadows and evading subsequent international warrants, his resistance to the systemic mechanisms of justice remains exceptionally high. Impact: 10 out of 10. The devastating legacy of Pedro Lopez fundamentally altered the criminological landscape of South America. His unprecedented victim count exposed catastrophic blind spots in international law enforcement and the systemic neglect of marginalized populations. The sheer scale of his predation forced regional governments to urgently reevaluate their penal codes and cross-border tracking protocols. He left entire communities traumatized and forever changed how authorities view the threat of transient, highly mobile predators, warranting the maximum possible impact score. Final score: 38 out of 50. With a total score of 38 out of 50, Pedro Lopez registers as a devastatingly mobile and impactful predator. What does it take for an ordinary person to become a predator, and how does society fail to see it? The subject was forged by extreme childhood trauma and systemic abuse, fracturing his fragile psychological foundation until he sought absolute control through violence. Society failed to see him because he hid seamlessly within its own blind spots, exploiting the severe poverty, neglect, and vast jurisdictional borders that marginalized his chosen victims. He proves that the most dangerous predators do not break the system. They simply slip through its pre-existing cracks.
Some monsters are born in the shadows. Others are the shadow itself. The verdict is etched in stone, but make no mistake, evil never stops. It simply changes its face. Many more monsters await dissection on this channel. Stay vigilant. Case closed.